Thank you, Derek, and thank you all the team for putting this together. You know, Professor Mara Kolesas, I'm very pleased to present this first conversation of this conversatory on racism. Racism, definitely not new, very important, but there has been a widening urgency to address it in the context of nationwide Black Lives Matter protests. I want to say a few words before introducing our guest today. It's very interesting that these protests are taking place in the context of a global pandemic when nothing seems to be given. We have this uncertainty about the future. So anything is possible, and it's the moment for great imagination. These conversations with distinguished scholars will tackle in depth how racism has consolidated in the US from its very foundation, how it has operated, how it was instilled, with the hope, and I wanted to stress that, to spark meaningful, informed, and respectful conversations with the speakers, among each other, and with oneself as well, right? But if we want to be effective, you know, about racism, it's not possible to do something until you understand exactly what it is you want to do something about, besides, you know, ending racism. What do we talk about when we talk about racism? Many times people think they're talking about the same thing, and they're not, because concepts are different, angles are different, and emphases are different, and all of that matters. And precisely because of this, it is my great pleasure to introduce our first guest of this conversatory, Daria Roithmayr. Daria, you read already, but I'm gonna say it, is a UC Gold School of Law professor. She teaches and writes about persistent structural racism and racial inequality in different contexts. Her work is deeply cross-disciplinary, drawing from history, economics, critical race theory, economics, always intended to make visible the invisible in more than one way. So today we're going to discuss her book, Reproducing Racism, published in 2014 by NYU. I hope I'm getting this correctly, where she makes a very compelling argument. Welcome, Daria, to the Virtual From Institute. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start. Let's not waste time. I mean, the book title is Reproducing Racism, How Everyday Choices Lock in White Advantage. There's a lot to unpack there, right? There are different understandings of racism, as well as what reproduction exactly means. There are different understandings of race, even though we think it's a social construct. It could have like a cultural emphasis, a political emphasis, a historical emphasis. So why don't we start by asking you, how do you understand these terms, and how did you come to the research question for this book?
I think the best way to get started is for me to present about 5 minutes worth of slides that outline the central argument of the book and maybe an example. And then we can launch into how it is that I came up with the idea for the book, some of which might actually be answered in the...
Okay, sounds good.
So, as Mara mentioned, the title of the book is Reproducing Racism. Can you see my slides, Mara?
Yes.
Okay. So the central argument of this book is, I think, a relatively simple one. And that is that racial inequality has become self-reinforcing over time. That is, racial disparities will persist even in the absence of intentional discrimination. It's a pretty strong claim. It's a claim about structural racism and not what most people think of when they think of racism, intentional discrimination. But in my view, it's the most important issue, right alongside up there with police brutality for us to tackle as a country. So the sequence of the argument can be laid out in 3 steps. First, I argue that historical racism takes place in the context of what I call racial cartels. And racial cartels, which I'll explain what those are when I come back to it, create a significant structural advantage. So during Jim Crow, organizations like homeowners associations intentionally exclude Black and sometimes brown home buyers from neighborhoods. White unions exclude Black workers from railroad jobs. These racial cartels create a significant material advantage for whites. The second part of the argument is contemporary, which is to argue that this advantage created early on has now become self-reinforcing through what I call positive feedback loops, these dynamic processes that reproduce racism, even in the absence of intentional discrimination. And the third step is to argue that this self-reinforcing process locks in inequality, and that in the absence of any meaningful intervention, racial disparities of the kind that I will discuss will persist indefinitely. A very sobering and depressing thought. So let's take each of those steps at a time. First, the argument is that racial cartels engage in exclusionary behavior. And in particular, we can use the example of racial cartels that segregate neighborhoods and schools. And when I say cartels, I mean organizations like homeowners associations that work together to anti-competitively make sure, for example, that Black home buyers don't buy in white neighborhoods. They spread restrictive covenants. They intimidate Black home buyers who do cross the color line. And in general, their target is to try to exclude Black home buyers from white neighborhoods and from white schools. The second part of the argument then is that concentrated wealth and advantage that's present in segregated neighborhoods now reproduces itself through positive feedback loops. Here's an example of the positive feedback loop that draws on what we were just talking about. Because homeowners associations successfully segregated white neighborhoods, even after the white neighborhood regulations are no longer legal, so restrictive covenants aren't legal, zoning ordinances that create racially homogeneous neighborhoods are no longer legal, a combination of race and class processes reproduces the very segregation that those cartels put in place. So white wealthy districts are able to finance public schools that produce white wealthy graduates because they are exposed to cutting edge computer and technology curriculum. And those white wealthy graduates in turn grow up to be white wealthy home buyers who can afford to buy into white wealthy neighborhoods, where Black and brown home buyers do not attend those schools, do not attend well-financed schools, and thus are not able to buy into white wealthy neighborhoods, even though restrictive covenants and zoning ordinances are no longer legal. So in this way, the positive feedback loop of class that has become racialized because of our history now reproduces itself over time. Then finally, the argument is that this self-reinforcing process has become locked in. That is, we can't really dislodge it, even in the absence of intentional discrimination. And you can see this by looking at a graph that portrays the racial gap in college degrees, which are related to people's experiences in elementary and high school. And you can see that the college degree gap has persisted from 1964 through to 2015 and is now even widening. And that's because of this positive feedback loop that reproduces the wealthy, white, segregated public schools that are not accessible to Black and brown home buyers or their children. So again, to summarize, the argument is that even if intentional discrimination were to end tomorrow, these gaps would persist indefinitely if nothing is done. And hopefully in the Q&A, we can talk about what might be done in order to remedy these feedback loops.
Thank you, Daria. Again, there's a lot of unpack there. Before moving into the nits and grits, how did you come up with the research question and the understanding you have about racism, right? The reproduction part, you know, got covered.
Yeah. So early on in my critical race theory circles, we had talked about the way in which racial inequality seemed to have been hardwired or had been plastered into the scaffolding, but we hadn't really theorized about how that might happen. We hadn't really come up with a theory to link past discrimination to present disparity. And I happened to pick up a book. It was on the book stack of a friend of mine. We trade books. And it was a random book. She just threw it at me as I was getting on a plane. And the book is called Complexity. And it's about these evolutionary dynamics that many complex systems like economies or neighborhoods engage in. And in the very beginning of that book was a story about the antitrust case against Microsoft and an economist who was making these kinds of arguments about technology cartels, the way in which those became self-reinforcing over time, even after the illegal behavior had ended. And the light bulb went off. Here was the theory that could explain how it was that past discrimination had become self-reinforcing to perpetuate the kind of advantages that antitrust lawyers end up talking about all the time. But we were now talking about racial cartels and processes that actually reproduced racial disparity rather than the kind of conventional antitrust conversation. So I found that theorizing in the antitrust world to be quite helpful to the conversations that we were having in critical race theory.
So a little bit of a personal note before, you know, asking a question. You're talking about complex system theory, right? Where the system is more than the sum of the individual, you know, parts. When I was looking for a place to live here, well, here in Berkeley, and I was pregnant, and the real estate agent, first of all, there was a real estate agent. They were telling us all about public schools, not about the house, about the public school. And I'm a foreigner. I didn't understand why. And it took me 6 years. You know, I gave birth, I had a son, he entered public school, to understand how crucial it was, even more than actually having a roof or a functioning kitchen. I want to know whether the kitchen functions, right? No, it was all about schools, because just 10 blocks away, when you have like a place in Oakland, you enter like a whole different universe. So we started with slavery, you know, and I want to, you know, point this out. So we started with slavery and the exclusion of Black people from the political community, right? Like they were not citizens, they didn't have equality and didn't have liberty. I want to emphasize in your argument, there's time is very important, right? Temporality. So this got locked in over time, right? You have Civil War and Reconstruction and Jim Crow and then the Civil Rights Movement. And still, with all of this, we have this persisting inequality and it self-reinforces itself. So the question is, you know, there's no intentional discrimination, right? But if the system reproduces itself without intentional discrimination, and you talk about, you know, accessing education and social capital, and also I want to point out that social capital brings you better access to health, right, in terms of connections and stuff like that. But by detaching like this intentional discrimination, there are like several, I wouldn't say problematic, but implications that we need to explore. And I'm trying to just push the critical conversation here. And one is, you talk about, you know, advantage at the very beginning, right? With the, like, the whites now, just to be perfectly open about it, are beneficiaries of these past wrongdoings, but not current, you know, wrongdoing. So point one is, doesn't that leave whites kind of like off the hook? So that, I mean, I'm putting it colloquially, but that would be, you know, one question. The other question is, what about individual agency? If, you know, without intentional, you know, discrimination, the system, you know, reproduces itself. And the third question, I mean, I need to bring it up because there are tons of scholarship and a lot of discussion, you know, about this. It's like, what do you think about the understandings of implicit bias, microaggressions? Because even though they don't change the big picture, they certainly change, may change the small picture. So these are the questions.
So I'm going to actually, in the interest of time, combine the first and third questions to say that I am fully cognizant that intentional discrimination continues. And in particular, in the school setting, you see intentional discrimination to the extent that, for example, parents in white school districts protest quite loudly when it looks like the public school policymakers are potentially going to change the feeder districts that feed into their schools. To the extent that their changes bring in more Black students, you see white parents protesting for a host of complicated reasons. But the project that I wanted to focus on was to make the point that even in the absence of any intentional discrimination, and I include implicit bias in that individual focused discrimination of the sort that I was just describing. Even if all of that were to end tomorrow, a magic wand, no one suffers from implicit bias. These individual choices that people don't think of as race conscious. So the choice to buy a house that gives you access to the best public school that you're able to afford. People don't think of that as a race conscious choice. The choice to give your children, if you're a white parent, a down payment on a house or money for college education, which, as I explain in the book, contributes to this self-reinforcing feedback loop of wealth transmission. No one thinks of that as intentional racism or race-conscious decision-making. And so, to the extent that there is agency in those decisions, then that's the kind of agency that contributes. But it's the kind of agency that no one is ever going to fault parents for doing. So no one faults a parent for choosing a neighborhood that gives them access to the best public school that money can buy, even when, in the majority of cases, if they're a relatively wealthy parent, that's going to be a relatively white school. That's not true in all cases, but in many cases. And so this is a project that really operates at the level of the collective, at the level of the population. And I think that to the extent that we can come up with remedies that solve this problem, they're not going to be individual agency remedies. It's not going to be a matter of going to an implicit bias training to discover your harboring preferences, although that might certainly help with regard to parents who object when the feeder districts are changed. It's not going to solve the kind of large-scale, complex system, collective problems that my book describes. But I take the point that it does seem to let contemporary whites off the hook because it focuses on the intentional agency of past discriminators.
So if I understand correctly, so you focus on the structural clearly so, and you know, implicit bias and things like that could help, but without addressing the structural, like a vision that, of course, you know that I agree with because we talk about it several times, it wouldn't change. Now, you raise very interesting points, and I mean, and it's thinking, and it has to be also with the ethos of the U.S. society, which is based on the individual, right? It's an moral individualism. And, you know, at the individual level, without having the scope of the collective and society, you know, these decisions are fully legitimate in the sense that they're not intended to harm anyone, but it's a question, as I was saying, like at the very beginning, of angle and emphasis, right? But I want to emphasize, you know, in your position, not only the structural vision that I deem crucial to move towards, you know, racial justice, whatever that may be, and I know that there are different understandings, right, of that. So, but the other point that I want to highlight, and I would like you to say a few things about, is that your vision is not only is your vision, you know, structural, but it's also relational. And not only relational and interpersonal level. I mean, I'm not talking about relational and interpersonal level, but relational in terms, you know, of groups. Because when I read the title, like advantage, it means that there's a group that is advantaged, but there is another group that is disadvantaged. And that's very, very different in scope than talking about poverty, because poverty can be understood in terms of absolute, you know, and in particular in the US, if you're poor, it is because you failed. There's a moral failure kind of in that poverty. And you also talk about inequality, you know, that is relational. So I want you to say a few things about that, but I want to say something else. I mean, it's the same thing, poverty, for me, than talking about privilege. For me, it's a very, very, very problematic terms. And you speak Spanish like me, and I don't know whether, you know, it's that kind of, you know, symbolic horizon I come from, but, you know, privilege doesn't decenter the focus from those oppressed, right? And privilege is like with kids, privilegio, like, oh, you don't have screen privilege. Well, forget about that in the distance learning, right? But it doesn't, it's like something extra, but it doesn't address this relational issue that is so crucial to understand your argument. And let's not speak about fragility, or actually let's do. So these are the comments, you know, for you to address.
So I'll say two things. First, inequality itself is inevitably a relational concept, because one can imagine in a country of great wealth, and there are many to choose from, maybe particularly in the Arab world, there's still being significant inequality between groups of people. In South Africa, where I've done a fair amount of work, there's an affirmative right to education. And I worked with the Education Rights Project, an NGO focused on eliminating the incredible poverty associated with the rural areas in the country. And we had to ask ourselves, do we want to use a constitutional clause that invokes an argument about inequality was the real problem that South African whites were continuing to enjoy public schools that looked like our fanciest private schools, while rural classes were being held under trees in the rural area? Or was the problem that the rural area schools fell below some absolute threshold of what it meant to have a meaningful education? And my argument was that we needed to address both. That the failure of those rural schools to transcend the poverty level was in large part because of this relational inequality that we have been talking about in the context of comparison. So I don't think you can really separate one without the other, but I understand the argument that we ought to be focusing on absolute thresholds. The problem is we don't know what that threshold is. So does a school without a swimming pool, is that the threshold? That the school must have facilities that give children the ability to engage in physical activity? Is it schools with books? And the difficulty in defining thresholds really creates an incentive to talk about inequality. You and I have had conversations about this notion of privilege versus advantage. And we've also talked about white fragility. And I think the notion of white privilege and white fragility, both of those are tied to a very identity-focused description of racism, where people intentionally or because of implicit bias discriminate against others. And so when people talk about privilege, they talk about things like the ability to walk into a department store without being followed, or the ability to walk into the street, this is quite a serious one, without having to worry about police brutality or police-involved shootings. My argument doesn't really address those kinds of claims, which I take very seriously, particularly in the policing context. But I'm more interested in the structural analysis and the advantage that comes with living in a neighborhood that, because of its wealth, will not be over-policed, will not be surveilled, will not be the subject of repeated police interaction because of the relative wealth of the neighborhood. And these structural advantages, thinking about, for example, policing in that context, as opposed to the implicit bias that police officers might experience, I find the structural aspects of racism both equally, if not more important, and maybe most notably under-theorized and under-discussed. So I find it fascinating in a conversation about Black Lives Matter, and which is a very materialist set of claims. And there are lots of socialists like Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor who are behind Black Lives Matter. White responses to Black Lives Matter have focused on taking statues down, on talking about white fragility and white privilege, instead of these big picture structural problems like segregated neighborhoods that drive so much of what's going on in terms of police brutality. So I find conversations about white advantage or white privilege and white fragility important, but that's not where my focus lies. And I think white advantage is a very material concept that's quite something different.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, yeah, I couldn't agree actually more. I find it even like, I'm a foreigner, so maybe I can say it. I find it very self-indulging. It's like, let's look at myself, focus on myself. And I understand it's difficult for people here, but at the same time, you know, the big picture, you know, doesn't change. And with these comments that you mentioned about the structure and Black Lives Matter, I wanted just to move from the institutional, you know, reproduction of racism to political movements, right? So there was the civil rights movement, which accomplished a lot, but we can place it at the intentional discrimination level, right? In terms of voting rights and laws. So I wanted to elaborate you more on the Black Lives Matter movement, because as you mentioned, you know, they address the material dimension, the structural with the ending systemic racism, but they also address, you know, the bias, right, of police and the profiling rather than the bias, like the explicit profiling, and that's intentional, of police, you know, of mostly Black, but not exclusively. So how do you see your understanding of the structural reproduction of racism vis-a-vis, or how do you analyze, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement? And I know it's heterogeneous, but, you know, if we can sum up demands, and then I'll ask you a follow-up, but just what do you think like these political, you know, claims are vis-a-vis your
Well, like you mentioned, it's a heterogeneous movement. The movement for Black Lives, which encompasses Black Lives Matter, encompasses a lot of other movements. And I think about the current moment more in that sense, as opposed to focusing just on Black Lives Matter. And as I mentioned, there is a combination of what we call materialist or structuralist analysis that focuses on things like the segregated neighborhoods that we've been discussing. There are also people like Loïc Vacon, who's done work connected to Black Lives Matter, in which they talk about the political economy of policing, the idea that policing is an institution that was created for the purpose of protecting white property against expropriation by the masses. And so policing has always been a racial project. This widens the lens again, as I try to do in my work, to think about the history of policing, to think about the history of segregated neighborhoods, and not just to focus on the current moment with regard to intentional or implicit bias. That said, I think, particularly with regard to policing, it's incredibly important to think about the kinds of policing that we saw in the Floyd video, where whatever you might think of structural racism, the impunity with which the officer knelt on Floyd's neck strikes everyone as something that's quite intentional and quite racial. And there are lots of complicated reasons for that, some of which I explore in a project that I'm doing on the contagiousness of police violence. I'm using mathematical models of contagion to explore some data in Chicago to see whether or not, if an officer observes another officer involved in a police shooting, does that officer become more likely to engage in shooting later on? And it won't surprise anyone to learn that police violence, in fact, is contagious. But I see these projects.
You didn't know about this project.
Do what?
You didn't tell me about this project.
Oh, no, I have many projects.
Surprises.
Yeah, yeah. But I see all of these projects as focused on the same goal, which is racial anti-subordination. And, you know, it's a project that's focused on equality, but also, as we were talking about earlier, on making sure that communities of color have the basic dignity that should be afforded to every group, especially in a country that prides itself on being so exceptional. And I'm not hostile to those projects. I'm fully supportive of those projects. I want the projects to widen the lens, and I've been in conversation with many Black Lives Matter activists like Keonga Taylor. I highly recommend her book, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation is the title. I think of racial liberation as the common goal for all of this.
So many questions. And so yes, I mean, when you were talking about Louis Vac, and there's also the recent article by Gilles Lepore that talks about how, you know, policing, you have the police, like the belonging to the political community, and those who didn't belong, who were policed.
Yeah.
And also that, you know, modern policing, if we're going to follow her argument as we know it, started in Berkeley, like, which just completely blew my mind. I want to tease out, you know, a little bit more of a political agenda, you know, if I may, because in your book, when you talk about complex system theory, you also discuss critical thresholds, right? So the idea is that the system is more than the sum of the parts, and also that small changes, given that, you know, you can't control the outcomes of interactions, like small changes may cause like enormous, or produce, not cause, like produce enormous shifts in patterns of interactions. So the question is, how do you see now the situations, and whether Black Lives Matter is actually looking at what might, because we can control what might these critical thresholds be to focus kind of political attention to that.
So let me just talk about something other than policing to make the point that small changes can make a big difference. So one of the things I end up talking about in the remedy section of the book is a project that got a lot of play during the 2016 election and got even more play during the 2020 election, particularly by way of people like Cory Booker. And it's a concept called children's trust funds. And the idea is that children of color should benefit from the same kind of accumulating wealth that white kids frequently do. And not necessarily with actual formal trust funds, but the kind of wealth that parents can invest early on that end up making a big difference for the child as he or she grows. And they actually did children's trust funds in the UK for a short while. And in that program, every child got 500 pounds at birth, a relatively small amount, 700 pounds if they were needy, and then another 500 or 700 pounds when they hit the age of 7. And parents could add money to the extent that they were able to afford to do so into that program. And for needy kids, the government would match that money. And they weren't able to touch the money until they were 18, and then they could only withdraw it for education, home purchasing, or retirement purposes. And that small amount of money is now becoming quite meaningful for the kids who are hitting the age of 18. Those accounts have tens of thousands of dollars that these children are now being able to access as a result of these small deposits that were made a relatively short time ago. And I think children's trust funds are fantastic because they help families and the children of families in poverty surpass what some people call the macabre threshold. I don't know if you remember, there's in a Charles Dickens novel, a character named Mr. Micawber, who's perpetually running out of money. He gets rich, but then he loses it all. And part of what the book describes is the way in which it's very difficult to actually start accumulating wealth because you're always using your money, as Mr. Micawber did, in short-term projects. And that's true for many families in poverty. And so one way of trying to push past that critical threshold, the threshold at which families can start accumulating wealth, is to use things like these children's trust funds, which really don't cost all that much at all, at least at the outset. And then if you targeted them and means tested them, could cost even less. So I think those are examples of the kinds of complex systems principles in action.
That's a great, issue as a proposal, because that's something very actionable, very particular, and something that can gather like a lot of, political support. But since you mentioned, a very important concept that I would like to spell out for the audience in particular, because it's going to come up in part 1 and part 2, later November, December, when someone is going to address it, hopefully, maybe, we don't know what's going to happen. But can you please spell out the concept of wealth? Because wealth is not the same as income, and it points to, what you just said. And this is huge in terms of, the primordial, not sin, but advantage, and how do you go past, that critical threshold.
Well, I think this crowd in particular might be more aware than most of the distinction between income and wealth. So income is what you earn from a job, or money coming in the door from a variety of income-related activities. Wealth is what you invest and can accumulate without ever reporting on your tax returns, because you're paying taxes on income and not wealth. So the primary source of wealth for most U.S. Residents is home ownership, the equity that you accumulate in your house. A fraction of U.S. residents also accumulate wealth through stocks and bonds. And we're probably all aware that African Americans make 70 cents on the dollar, depending on whose numbers you look at. But most of us are not aware. And then I think the Latinx community is somewhere around the same, depending on the numbers that you look at.
And it's different between men and women, by the way.
Yes, of course. Women are always plagued by the double whammy of both gender and race, women of color. But most people aren't aware that Black and brown wealth is hugely disparate compared to white wealth. So Black wealth is 8 cents, not 80 cents, 8 cents on every dollar of white wealth. And Latinx wealth is, I think, 10 cents on the dollar, again, depending on where you look. And these disparities are massive, and they're persistent over time. And so, again, because most white wealth is in home ownership, Black and brown home ownership become incredibly important. And the notion of segregated neighborhoods that people can't afford to buy into means that they are not able to access the kind of wealth building that home ownership can bring. And in particular, the federal government was very involved in barring the door for Black and brown home buyers. Many people don't know this. There's a great book about it called Crabgrass Frontiers, that when whites moved to the suburbs, the federally subsidized mortgages that were the innovation of the period were available to white homeowners in white neighborhoods, but the federal government redlined Black neighborhoods and Black home buyers so that they weren't eligible to take advantage of those subsidized mortgages. And what that meant was that where white ethnics, in particular whites from Southern Europe, who were now eligible to move to the suburbs, were able to take advantage of wealth accumulation in a way that Black and brown would-be home buyers were just not able to. And that is a huge driver of wealth disparities in this country, and a reason why the subprime mortgage crisis, which really diminished numbers in terms of Black and brown home buyers, was such a crushing blow to the accumulation of wealth for the Black and brown community.
And that point, I'm glad you brought that up, because that point not only touches on wealth, but actually it touches upon who actually could just go past that critical threshold, to create like the small shifts that actually create like a changing pattern. Because Irish people, if I understand correctly, and Jews from, Eastern Europe or Europe, as you mentioned, they got a break, so to speak, into the home owning opportunities. And that, even though they were definitely discriminated against, in different realms of the US life, that created like an exponential differential into, making it to
It's like that accumulating bank account, right?
Uh-huh.
And so, you know, there's a lot of people ask questions about Asians and Jews. Well, what about them, and how come they weren't caught up in these self-reinforcing feedback loops? And you have to consider the history of each group very carefully in terms of who came, when they came, with what money did they come, how long did they stay, for example, in the shtetl, in the segregated community, which is on average much less time than Blacks spent in segregated neighborhoods and segregated areas of the city. So the specifics, the evolutionary history of each group's arrival in terms of who was able to come, as opposed to African Americans who were brought as property, all of that makes a difference when you think about the initial conditions that then trigger the accumulation of wealth. I've written quite a lot about those different histories.
Yeah, I wanted to, because you talk in particular about Nigerians, right? That the immigration pattern of Nigerians, and you know, I think it's quite different. And Ngozi, I can never pronounce like her last name, but I love her book Americana, because I am not Black, but as a foreigner to the US, you know, I saw all these things that jumped to my head. She just talk about like non-American, you know, Blacks, and how this different trajectory was different. So that's one point. But I wanted to ask you in terms of this wealth, because I have been involved in Latina community circles, and a huge issue about the accumulation of wealth, and I wanted to know your opinion about this since it's so important, had to do with cultural practices, right? And the imaginary. I mean, the understanding, I'm not saying I agree with that or not, but this is how these, you know, Latinx philanthropists were addressing the issue. I had my normative reservations, but let's put it that way. It's like we need to educate Latinos to accumulate wealth and not live kind of dollar to dollar. So I wanted to know whether you have done, because this I'm not aware of, whether you've done any research or what your thoughts are about this.
So let me start by saying there's certainly room for outreach and education to educate members of the community on the importance of engaging in these wealth accumulating activities. The trouble is, if you don't have the money to invest or to save, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, if you're surviving, but barely, if you're below the macabre threshold, then it isn't a matter of not knowing, it's a matter of not being able to. So that's one thing to say. To talk about cultural practices more generally, there's a way in which I think that has been, up until now, the primary argument that conservatives on the issue of race have tried to make. So it used to be, back during explicitly racist Jim Crow and slavery, it was that Blacks and Browns were not able to, Black and Brown people were not able to engage in success because they were biologically inferior. And nobody makes that, well, almost nobody makes that argument anymore. But now the argument is they're culturally inferior. And there was quite a shocking book authored by two Yale law professors called Triple Package by Amy Chua, famous for her Tiger Mother celebrity, and her husband, Jed Rubenfeld. And their argument was, look, there are these immigrant groups that really have succeeded and blossomed where native-born Black and Brown folks have not, and they pointed to Nigerians and Cubans. And their argument was there was something cultural that they had brought with them that explained their success. And I have a book review in Slate magazine where I take down that argument point by point. But suffice it to say that depending on the wave of Cubans that you look at, there's been great success. The early Cubans, predominantly white, wealthy folks who got relocation packages and were bringing their art to the US before Castro took over, they're doing quite well. The Marielitos, the Black Cubans who come in the 80s in boat lift programs, not so well. Nigerians who have come in order to get education and whose visas are education based are doing quite well in the first generation. But when you look at second and third generations where they begin to be more seamlessly integrated into the Black community, not so well. So it depends on who comes, when they come, how they come, with what money do they come, because these initial conditions of their arrival, whether they come as chattel property or as wealthy refugees welcomed by the US government, makes a huge difference. And so I'm not averse to the idea that culture makes a difference, but let's fix the structural problems and dismantle the feedback loops, and then we can talk about culture. Then we can see how much of this is culture and how much of this is actually structure. And I would wager that if we were able to dismantle these feedback loops that I've described, that culture would play a much smaller role than conservatives think that it does.
Yeah, there are some questions that I'm going to leave for the Q&A about how we dismantle that. And I want to make sure I have the opportunity to ask you one last question. But what I wanted to say about the cultural issue is that even though, and I go back to the question of emphasis, even though it may play a role, as you pointed out, the problem is the political uses of the cultural argument. And one has to be incredibly vigilant, to what, the unspoken behind the argument, is. But since we have 5 minutes before the questions, I know you have a huge book project, and I'm not super changing the conversation because, of course, your work is also on racism from a different angle. You're working on a book called Racism Pays, and I would like you to share with us, a little bit about the project. We haven't defined racism, how you understanding, but here you shifted a little bit to economic exploitation, if I understand correctly. So can you please tell us, a little bit about it? Have you expanded the concept of racism, illuminated other areas, groups, just so people can buy your book when it's out?
That's not going to be for a while. So
doesn't matter. They put it in the to-do list. I'm sure they will.
So I've just started this project. As Mara says, it's a book called Racism Pays. It's a book that focuses on the way in which racial exploitation provides the engine for a lot of our most vaunted innovations at the moment. In particular, digital platforms, digital rideshare companies, for example, like Uber and Lyft, and also artificial intelligence and machine learning, which are also big digital innovations. And I argue that just as racial exploitation was at the heart of the emergence of the cotton economy, and racial exploitation was at the heart of the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, so too is racial exploitation at the heart of these projects. What people aren't aware of is that even though many Lyft and Uber drivers are casual drivers, that the business model hangs together only because there is a small group of full-time drivers, about 9 or 10% of drivers, who supply over 50% of all of the rides. And I'll let you take a guess as to how many of that small group are people of color, people who are doing full-time work for no benefits, no overtime, no health care, no retirement, and for what amounts to, in many instances, either a sub-minimum wage or in 8% of the cases, no money at all, which takes them time to figure out because they have to factor in long-term expenses as well as short-term expenses. 70% of full-time drivers are people of color. And people of color include not just native-born Black and brown drivers, but immigrants as well. And depending on the city, the drivers can be more immigrant as opposed to native born. But the business model hangs on this group of people, and yet when Uber and Lyft are confronted about this, they talk about the casual drivers. People do this for fun. They don't want to become employees, but they ignore the material realities of this very small but very important group of people on which the companies are built. Likewise, ghost workers who are labeling the data that your smartphone or smart car is using. Those ghost workers, in the emergence of the digital age with regard to machine learning and artificial intelligence, were largely global workers from the global south, that is. So for example, the creation of these data sets that computers are trained on to be able to recognize images, human has to label these images. This is a cat, this is a pedestrian. And those ghost workers that label those images came from India. They did the project through Amazon Turk. They were paid a half to a third of what US workers were paid, 3 cents a label. And you get people like Bill Gates and Reid Hoffman saying, this is the new digital economy. You can hire someone for 10 minutes, not even knowing their name, pay them pennies per task, and fire them when you don't need them. And this exploitation of workers from the global south really is in many ways the wave of the future that capitalists like Gates and Hoffman are depending on to be able to launch their new innovations. So that's the project in a nutshell.
That's wonderful. I just wanted to push on a question that I know you got like a huge discussion that I heard at some point with Glenn Gould, I think, about what's your understanding of people of color? I'm a foreigner, so I have a problem with that term because I think it's euphemistic and it may be a catch-all, and when it's vague, it confuses, you know, sometimes the argument rather than makes it explicit. So how you understand people of color? Is it really like origin? It's, I mean, from what you said, it's not. Is it shared experiences, you know?
Well, of course, there's no explicit definition. There's no dictionary that says this is what people of color means. It's a term that gets used in common parlance, and I use it in much the same way that other race activists use it to designate a group of people who have been systematically excluded. And so when I talk about people of color, I frequently refer to Black and brown drivers to be much more explicit about it, because there is, you know, Asian is a pan-ethnic designation. So there are some Asian groups that are actually doing quite well. They're the coders and the systems analysts in Uber and Lyft. They tend to be Chinese, Japanese, or Korean. But other Asian groups, the Hmong, the Thai and Cambodian driver population, who experience material levels of poverty that look very much like Black and brown. So I mean to refer to communities that have been historically excluded and are still suffering from the kinds of disparities that I discuss in my book.
There's so much. I mean, we could, you know, thank you, Daria. There's so much more that I would continue the conversation, but to be fair, and we're 1 minute over, I want to be super fair to everyone who's been submitting questions. So if you are ready,
yes,
I will just bring up, you know.
Before I stay, while she's bringing up questions, I know that some people would like a break. I'm responsible for asking that we go through the break, but I'm doing it because I want to get to as many of your questions as possible. So if you are unhappy about it, let me.
So that's great. We're not getting any comments in the chat line. So I'm gonna just silence speaks. I'm gonna take that as a please continue.
Yeah.
And I wanna go through a lot. One, I'm going to just, I mean, someone is asking about Isabel Wilkinson's book Case, which we discussed, and neither of us read it. So I'm going to leave the question because to issue, I had the feeling this issue was going to come up, to issue like an informed, answer. But so one question is,
I did read some excerpts, and I do think the big
question, you can read it.
No, I read some excerpts, and all I'll say about that is I think the big question is whether caste as a concept does the kind of work that Isabel Wilkerson wants it to do. But to answer the question, I have to read the entire.
Yeah, that was the question we discussed. I mean, I haven't read it, and I'm curious. I mean, it has its good effect, right?
Yeah.
So one question is, to what extent is the system you describe depending as much on class as on race? There are examples, right, in Oakland, for example, where a high-performing integrated into elementary school with high parental participation was being merged with a school ranked among the lowest 5% in the state. Parents protested, both Black and white, and related to this, what steps are recommended, to remedy these structural problems, right, and their consequences that you discuss.
So I think it's a great question because it gives me the opportunity to underscore that the feedback loops that frequently give rise to persistent disparity are very much powered by class. So where you see integrated neighborhoods, and the Bay Area is a place, in Oakland in particular, where you do see more integrated neighborhoods. Black middle-class parents are in many ways participating in the feedback loops, having gotten in the door into those integrated neighborhoods, now wanting to make sure that the concentrated wealth and privilege that they're enjoying in those neighborhoods and in those public schools is preserved. And if you bring in a group of kids who are materially needier, whose parents won't be able to contribute the same amount of wealth, whose tax base is lower, then of course the parents who have gotten in the door, regardless of their race, will protest. So those feedback loops are very much powered by class, but of course class in most areas of the country, especially when you look at wealth, the Bay Area, some parts of Los Angeles and New York notwithstanding, is racialized and racialized quite starkly. So it's a great question with regard to recognizing that this is a race plus class story, and that there will be instances in which middle class families are Black or brown, instances in which class and race don't map very neatly onto each other. But as a general proposition, we can say that class is racialized, especially when it comes to schools.
So to add something to the second part of the question, to the remedies of the structural problems, if you can address whether there are like points to dismantle, these conflation or partial but very strong conflation between class and race, right? Because
so
that's
just about to address in terms of remedies, and I'm amazed that it's taken an hour and 5 minutes for people to recognize that we haven't discussed remedies other than the Children's Trust Fund. So there are a number of remedies to talk about with regard to schools and with regard to home ownership. In the book, I discuss remedies at a pretty high level, and so I'll say a little bit about what I say in the book. If you want to dismantle a feedback loop that reproduces racial disparity, you have a choice of either jump-starting the feedback loops for communities of color, like the Children's Trust Fund, or equalizing downward to dismantle the feedback loops that are providing access to white wealth. So one way of doing that, for example, might be, at least in theory, changing the way we finance public education And so a number of states have moved away from using local property taxes as the primary mechanism to finance schools and towards more centralized systems. But of course, in California, we know what happened when the California Supreme Court ruled that the segregation of school districts on the basis of financing was unconstitutional, and ruled that property taxes needed to be put into a big pot that then would be distributed with regard to need. Voters voted for a proposition that essentially froze property taxes at the 1970s levels in order to ensure that if a central pot were going to be used to distribute money for public education, that pot just wouldn't have a whole lot of money in it. And so in many ways, the story of California is a story that illustrates that when you try to take steps to dismantle feedback loops that concentrate wealth and privilege, that there will be counter moves to take opportunities to re-instantiate that privilege. So for example, LAUSD is a district that is historically, Los Angeles, historically underfinanced, but the Palos Verdes schools have $1 million in a slush fund for use by the school for technology and for teaching assistants. And the parents in Palos Verdes schools are required to volunteer their time. If you price that time out, you know, at the rate that those professionals usually make, it would be worth millions of dollars. So they've recreated in the kind of private PTA sphere the ability to accumulate wealth and privilege, and have at least earlier on made sure that the centralized mechanisms just weren't able to distribute that much money. So it illustrates the point that when you try to equalize downward, when you try to dismantle white feedback loops, you get a lot of pushback. Politically, it's very difficult to do. And so many people think that the only way to go about this is to try to jumpstart feedback loops for communities of color, like in the Children's Trust Fund.
Yeah, it's problematic because that happened in Berkeley as well. I don't want to give details because I would be given even, you know, names, but there's an issue with certain school, and there was the idea of like the money that we donate, right, to schools to be distributed equally. And there was a huge pushback because, you know, some people want the money to go to their kids in their school. And we're talking about 16 schools in Berkeley. I'm not talking about like a huge system. So, so one question is, so that was the previous question was by Debbie Nosowski, and this question is from Elizabeth Frommer. So how can you discuss structural racism and wealth without relating it to capitalism, right? So that's, you know, a huge question. And related to that, like they may be kind of connected. Robert Schaffner asked, Mara made a statement that the racist system built on the concept of case, I didn't say that, but like racist system in the US are not intentional. We didn't get this time in history for race relationship in the US without intentionality. The concept of redistribution of wealth must be addressed because we're not going to solve the problem through savings accounts. So we have there the issue of capitalism, redistribution, and I would add, you know, the relationship between the individual, the market, and the public dimension, that I'm so glad people are asking those questions.
So I completely agree with Elizabeth Frommer. In fact, if I had been allowed to write the remedies chapter that I wanted to write, it would be that we have to dismantle capitalism. We can talk about whether that certainly wasn't as salient a topic in 2014 as it is now. And in fact, I'm struggling with the same issue with regard to the new book, Racism Pays. Do I advocate the end of capitalism and dismantling capitalism, Or do I talk about worker ownership, which is, I think, the direction that I'm going to go in? Let workers of color be shareholders in these companies so that they can profit from their essential services for these firms. I think the tie between capitalism and that project is very easy to see because I draw on a lot of work by economic historians like Sven Beckert, who show that slavery was certainly essential at the center of the emergence of the cotton economy. And I show in the same way that racial exploitation is at the center of these digital innovations as part of the new phase of capitalism that is at least ostensibly going to push us forward. The previous project, because I was focused on market failures, using this antitrust language of market failure, it was more a project that was meant to persuade people who were never going to be dissuaded from the virtues of capitalism. The free marketeers from the University of Chicago who think that free markets are the solution to every problem. And I wanted to use, in some sense, an internal critique using antitrust language that focused on market failures in cases like Microsoft's to show that the market had failed in this instance, that advantage reproduced itself, disadvantage became even more progressively shut out. And so that plus my publisher and agent's insistence, and I kind of regret it, but not really, because I took the point, this was an internal critique, explain why I didn't make points about capitalism more forcefully in the first project, but that will change in the second project. In terms of the notion of intentionality, I think the presentation at the beginning made very clear that intentionality was very much a part of the creation of these structures, homeowners associations that were intentionally excluding Black home buyers from neighborhoods in Chicago. And the project of feedback loops is meant to show that even in the absence of continuing intentional discrimination, disparity reproduces itself. And it's not that intentional discrimination isn't happening, it's just that even if it were to disappear, these disparities would persist. I totally agree that children's savings account aren't going to solve the problem. And we come inevitably to the point that I came to with my publishers and my agent, what we call the tequila moment, where we acknowledge that in the absence of some revolution that heralds the end of capitalism, that these structures are so deeply entrenched, deeply embedded. We're going to give wealth to our kids to give them a good head start, white folks, as well as Black and brown folks. We're going to refer our friends for jobs. We're going to continue making all the choices that we make and we understand as not race conscious. And as a result, it will be very hard to dismantle these persistent disparities. And it may happen at some point, but I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime, and I'm not holding my breath. I am continuing to try to think through ways to dismantle these kinds of disparities, and worker ownership is kind of where I'm at the moment.
I want to take more questions, but I want to tease out from what you said. I mean, a relationship that is very complex between capitalism, and the state and the public dimension, because dismantling capitalism, I mean, I agree with you, is not going to happen, at least not anytime soon. But if we can rescue in your argument some degree of intentionality that is addressed to the political, in the sense that you mentioned, for example, the bonds or Prop 13. And I'm making this point because there are two questions about it, right? Just to link your argument and rescuing, this possibility, because also in your argument, this unexpected shift can cause great change. So I want to leave like a little bit of kind of hope or actionability, right? So if I may, right? So Olive Shoganasi, and I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it correctly, and I apologize, asks, are you saying Prop 13 was primarily to maintain segregation as it stood? This makes so much sense to me, but I never made a connection. I'm so glad about this question because this conversatory is about making connection and
Yeah.
expanding our horizon.
So this isn't my original argument. There are a lot of people who've argued before me that this is what Prop 13 was about. And I think that Prop 13 passed for lots of reasons, but certainly the connection between Prop 13 and the Supreme Court case, finding that they now had to centralize school financing, were connected. Yeah.
I'm reading a question. So there was a question about the child ones that I can't find. So if someone wants to retype, I don't know what happened, but I'm going to ask a question that Nancy Severns asked, and that is, how does the charter school system reinforce or break up feedback loops?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it really depends on the charter school. So first, we should acknowledge that the impulse towards charter schools is a very understandable impulse. It reflects the significant failures of the public education system. It's an opportunity to try to create from the bottom up what isn't being created from the top down. In general, I'm anti-charter school because it pulls money from the public education system or reconfigures the public education system in a way that in many areas ends up further disadvantaging communities of color. But that's not always true. So for example, a dear friend of mine who recently passed away, Daniel McLaughlin, was the founder of a charter school system called One Purpose Schools, whose chief focus was to serve the underserved Black and Brown students in the Bay Area. And it was wildly successful as an educational project. Financially ran into some difficulty, although I think it was limping by. And I've just read, I was very sad to read, that they're closing their doors, whether that's because of Daniel's death or because of the pandemic. It's hard to say. But I'm very supportive of those kinds of projects as charter school projects. But finances are an issue. It's hard to sustain those kind of charter schools. And so I think the answer is a mixed answer that really depends on the specifics of the school, of its mission, of the community it serves, of its financing. And I'm not going to tar all charter schools, maybe just most charter schools, with a negative brush.
So there's a question, and I think this is a critical question, Anonymous. Have you seen other dismantling ideas that are smaller, more individuals? Anything we can do to help jumpstart the dismantling of these feedback loops? I think that people are eager to understand whether there's some residue of agency that we can activate, and maybe I mean, you want to say more about the loops that are close to us, which is family, wealth, the neighborhood, the schooling, social networking, like just kind of thinking outside that kind of capital that will circulate among a close group of people.
Yeah. Here's what I would suggest if people want individual things that they can do. Two things, actually. One, and I'm doing this all the time, be on the lookout. And let me just step back for a minute and say both of these have to do with a feedback loop that relates to social networks through which jobs are referred. And the argument is that white social networks are more likely to contain people who are employed at good jobs with high wages and opportunities for advancement. Black and brown networks are more likely to contain people who are underemployed or unemployed at low-wage jobs in the informal economy. They don't have as much of an opportunity for advancement. And so the notion of social networks as a way of distributing material opportunity, of distributing jobs in particular, is one that I discussed quite a bit in the book. And so I would recommend two things. One, when you are hiring for jobs, if you're participating in a hiring process, be very conscious of the pool from which you are recruiting. It tends to be in even in formal recruiting, but definitely in informal recruiting, word of mouth recruiting. Who do you know? Who's in your network? Who can you recommend? And be sure to include people who are not in your networks. Make the effort to reach out to other people who are not in your networks, whose networks will include people who might be potential candidates for the job. And so, for example, when we hire at the University of Southern California, not only do we put out the word amongst our faculty community, we're looking for somebody who teaches civil procedure, we also tap people whom we know to be much better connected. So a colleague of mine at Duke University who has made it his mission to become a network hub to gather the names of people who are looking to go on the teaching market. And then in the same breath, I think be very vigilant to call out hiring practices that end up advantaging the incumbents who are more likely to be connected. So again, to use the faculty example, there are quite a few professors who come for a visit where the screening process is a lot more informal, and then by virtue of having visited are now present in the community, people get to know them, and so they kind of come in the door that way as opposed through a formal process. And almost all of those visitors, because it's a less formal process, end up being so-and-so knows so-and-so, a more informal word of mouth kind of recruiting. And I'm the poop in the punch bowl on my faculty who always says, wait a minute, if we're gonna hire for this position, we need to extend this search to a formal search where much wider groups of people are advised and recruited for this position as opposed to the more informal, somebody who knows somebody who comes in now to onto our radar in that way. And so I would say find ways to distribute referrals for jobs to a much wider group of people, and that means expanding your social network. And that's very difficult for people to do. It's interesting. Go and look at the pictures of all of the folks on your Facebook pages and notice how racially homogenous they are, if Facebook or Instagram is an accurate representation of people's social connections. And I would be in favor, for example, of for jobs that are filled through word of mouth, requiring all white companies to use a formal database full of only people of color to hire until they have some representation in their ranks. And that's law firms as well as smaller, more informal companies, until they have a sufficient number of people of color in their ranks that they can use then to tap folks in their social networks. So that's one possibility.
You know, that's great, Daria. And when, you know, UC Berkeley, a public university, did its strategic plan 10 years ago, and I was involved in, you know, pushing for all these practices to diversify, the pushback of certain departments to expand the applicant pool to people who were not represented at the university, again, public university, UC Berkeley, was insane. So it requires being very vigilant at the very, very reticular level, right? Because these things, you know, happen. And so I got again the question about the Children's Trust Fund, and I'm really happy because it's related to a question that's gonna come up in our fourth event of the series, so I'm really glad. So it's Elizabeth Frommer again. She's asking, would you consider children's trust fund a form of reparations? And that's the point that, you know, Marty Cartier is going to bring up in our last session on the Constitution on race, or a starting point for that discussion, and also who decides on which children, basically who decides who's eligible, right?
Yep. Yep. Also, that last part is pretty easy to answer. To the extent that it's a political project, the political process decides who is eligible. In the UK, they sold it by making everyone eligible. And I've seen some data to indicate that the wealthiest didn't participate, but the middle class did. I haven't seen any data on the racial breakdown of people who were able to take advantage of that. But if you could sell it in this moment, in this 15 minutes where we're all committed to racial equality as something that you can either target with regard to race, which might be unconstitutional depending on how we think about it, but maybe more promisingly can target on the basis of wealth, given what I said about the racial disparities in wealth. A wealth means test might be a way to sell this because it would make some whites eligible. That might be the way to go. You know, I've thought a lot about reparations, both with regard to this last project that I'm talking about today and the future project in terms of racism pays. And
it's a tough one.
Yeah, so I think of reparations as repair for the past. And many forms of reparations are not necessarily individualized reparations. People propose reparations in which money is tied to urban development programs. People seem to be allergic to the idea of giving people money, which I'm not at all allergic to, given what the research says happens when you give people money.
But isn't that interesting with all the
there's this notion of repairing for past bad behavior and maybe acknowledging present bad behavior. But reparations as a concept seems to leave in place the structures. So children's trust funds could be considered a form of reparations, but you could also consider it a means to dismantle the structures, the structural feedback loops. Mm-hmm. So I'm not averse to thinking about reparations, but I'm interested almost exclusively in those reparations, worker ownership, you know, back pay, giving people money as back pay versus worker ownership looking forward. I'm interested in reparations that are, to the extent that you can call them that are forward looking and dismantle the feedback loops that reproduce racial disparities.
Yeah, that's a great point. What I find very interesting, if not completely mind-boggling, actually, is that there's a huge reluctancy, you know, to talk about reparations, and at the same time, like an absolute ease for, I mean, for those who have means, right, for philanthropy. And what this means is that basically, you know, there is like a distrust of the public dimension, of the public good. Like we should completely recenter, you know, how we understand this thing.
Oh, but it's also, it's not that you deserve it, it's that we deign to give it to you out of our philanthropic hearts. Right?
Individual morality, yes, absolutely, from a position of privilege.
Yeah.
Right. Yes, but I mean, the erosion of the public good and the public entity kind of comes up in all of these discussions. And of course, that's the most difficult thing to address. But, you know, from what you are saying, you know, together with the structural issue, this is what should always be in the back of our minds, right? Is this eroding public goods? or it's actually supporting them? You know, are we doing something to just damage this or build it for everybody?
Yeah.
So we do not have any more questions, and it's again 1 minute after. But
This
is
is
there
Visual
any
Website.
is there any closing comment that you want to make? I'm just so grateful to you, Daria, to have this opportunity to share your insights with everybody. It's
Yeah,
always
I very much appreciate the opportunity. It's a little difficult not having the faces of folks that I'm speaking to in front of me, but I am still grateful very much for the opportunity to reach such a wide audience. And I plan on, if I can, attending some of your conversatories as a lurker because the program looks so fantastic. And you should be applauded for putting this kind of project together. So bravo to you, brava to you, and congratulations.
It takes a village. I want to extend, your thanks to everybody at the From Institute, working remotely. They've been super creative and supportive of this enterprise in such a difficult time. So they stood up to the need when it was needed the most in the most difficult times. So I look forward to having you all. Thank you all that I can't see, but I know you're there, to have you for the whole series, part 1, and also part 2 with amazing people. And I don't know where, Derek, do you want to say something?
I do. I want to say thank you to you both. This was amazing and very insightful. And it looks like everyone really enjoyed it. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.